Members of North Point Baptist Church described March 3, 2011, and the events surrounding the discovery of Clint Dobson and Judy Elliott. Church member Dale Harwell had plans to meet Dobson for lunch. When Dobson did not arrive at the appointed time, Harwell tried unsuccessfully to contact him. Deborah Jenkins went to North Point at around 12:40, where she saw Dobson's and Elliott's cars in the parking lot. Jenkins rang the doorbell and called the church office but received no answer, so she left after about 5 minutes. She returned 15 minutes later, and Elliott's car, a Mitsubishi Galant, was no longer in the parking lot. At 1 p.m., another church member, Suzanne Richards, arrived for a meeting with Pastor Dobson. His car was in the parking lot, but Elliott's was not. Richards waited for half of an hour, ringing the doorbell, calling, and texting Dobson. Meanwhile, Clint Dobson's wife, Laura, called Jake Turner, the part-time music minister, because she had been unable to reach her husband by phone. Turner agreed to go to the church, and he called Judy Elliott's husband, John, who promptly drove to the church. John entered the church using his passcode and called out Pastor Dobson's name. John saw Dobson's office in disarray and saw a severely beaten woman, whom he did not immediately recognize as his wife, lying on the ground. He did not notice Dobson lying on the other side of the desk. John called the police. Arlington police officer Jesse Parrish responded to the call. He noticed signs of a struggle, including blood and what appeared to be a grip plate of a pistol. Elliott was lying on her back with her hands bound behind her. John recognized his wife by her clothing. Parrish found Dobson lying face up with his hands bound behind his back. A bloody plastic bag was covering his head and sucked into his mouth. Upon lifting the plastic bag off of his head, Parrish knew that Dobson was dead. Elliott was taken to the hospital in critical condition. She had a heart attack while there, and neither the physicians nor John believed she would survive. She had traumatic injuries to her face, head, arms, legs, and back, and internal bleeding in her brain. She was in the hospital for 2 weeks and underwent 5 months of therapy and rehabilitation. A permanent fixture of mesh, screws, and other metal holds her face together. At the time of trial, Elliott still had physical and mental impairments from the attack. On March 3, 2011, Stephen Lawayne Nelson, then 24 years old and already on probation in Dallas County, entered North Point Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. There he assaulted and suffocated its pastor, Clint Dobson, and assaulted their secretary, Judy Elliott. While there, Nelson stole Dobson's laptop and cell phone, Elliott's credit cards, and her car. Nelson was charged with capital murder by intentionally causing Dobson's death in the course of committing, or attempting to commit, the offense of robbery. A jury found Nelson guilty of capital murder and answered the special issues so that appellant was sentenced to death. Stephen Lawayne Nelson has been on Texas's death row for 13 years. He has been scheduled to be put to death by lethal injection on February 5, 2025. Dr. Nizam Pirwani, the medical examiner for Tarrant County, testified that the manner of Pastor Dobson's death was homicide. Dobson's injuries indicated a violent altercation during which he attempted to shield himself from blows from an object, such as the butt of a firearm. 2 wounds to his forehead appeared to be from the computer monitor stand in the office, according to Dr. Pirwani. The injuries indicated that Pastor Dobson was standing when he was first struck in the head and that he was struck in the back of his head as he fell. After he had fallen to the ground and lost consciousness, his hands were tied behind his back, and the bag was placed over his head. With the bag over his head, he suffocated and died. After fleeing the scene of the murder and stopping at his apartment, Nelson drove Elliott's car to a Tire King store, where a customer bought Pastor Dobson's laptop and case out of the trunk of the Galant. At around 2 p.m., Nelson drove to a Tetco convenience store, where he used Elliott's credit card to buy gas, a drink, and a cigar. Nelson then went to the parks at Arlington Mall. Using Elliott's credit cards at Chic Shoes, he purchased a t-shirt featuring the Sesame Street character Oscar the Grouch and Air Max shoes. He also used the cards to buy costume jewelry at Jewelry Hut and Silver Gallery. Nelson later returned to Chic Shoes with 2 companions, but a second attempt to use the credit card was not approved. While taking pills and smoking, he told a friend that he had stolen the gallant from a pastor. Throughout the course of the next day, Nelson sent a series of text messages. One asked to see the recipient because it might be the last time. Another said, "Say, I might need to come up there to stay. I did some shit the other day," cause the third said, "I fucked up bad, cause real bad." Officers obtained an arrest warrant and arrested Nelson at a friend's apartment on March 5th. At the time of his arrest, Nelson was wearing the tennis shoes and some of the jewelry he brought with Elliott's stolen credit cards. He was also wearing a black belt with metal studs. The shoes, belt, phone, and jewelry were seized during Nelson's jail booking. Officers seized other items from Nelson's apartment pursuant to a search warrant. They recovered a pair of black and green Nike Air Jordan tennis shoes that appeared to match a bloody shoe print at North Point, the New Orleans Saints jersey seen on the mall surveillance videos, a gold chain necklace, a pair of men's silver earrings with diamond-like stones, a Nike Air Max shoebox, a Chic Shoes shopping bag, a Sesame Street price tag, a Jimmy Jazz business card, and receipts dated March 3rd from several of the stores. Officers found Pastor Dobson's identification cards, insurance cards, and credit cards in Elliott's car. DNA from Dobson and from Elliott was discovered in a stain on Nelson's shoe. Nelson's fingerprints were lifted from the wrist rest on Pastor Dobson's desk, from receipts, and from some of the items from the mall. A trace evidence analyst detected similarities between Nelson's shoe and a bloody shoe print on an envelope in Dobson's office. Nelson's belt appeared to be missing studs, and similar studs were recovered from the church office. Nelson testified on his own behalf. According to him, from about 11:30 p.m. on March 2nd until 6 o'clock or 7 a.m. on March 3rd, he and 3 companions were looking for people to rob. They had firearms. Nelson went home for a while in the morning, but later joined up with his 2 friends. Nelson claimed that he waited outside the church while his 2 companions went in. 25 minutes later, he went inside and saw the victims on the ground. They were bleeding from the backs of their heads, but they were still alive. Nelson then took the laptop and case. According to Nelson, his friend gave him keys and credit cards. Nelson waited in Elliott's car for a while, and then returned to Pastor Dobson's office. By that time, the man was dead. Nelson said he couldn't stand the smell, so he returned to Elliott's car. He drove the group to his apartment, retrieved a CD and his New Orleans Saints jersey, and continued to another friend's apartment, where they smoked marijuana. Nelson then left the apartment in Elliott's car. Nelson testified that he knew people were inside the church and that he agreed to rob them. He claimed that he did not intend to hurt anyone, and had no part in what happened inside of the church. He also acknowledged making the purchases at Tetco and buying the items at the mall. He also testified to having several prior convictions. Nelson was classified as an assaultive inmate in the Tarrant County Jail while awaiting trial. For a time, he was in restrictive housing, but he nevertheless committed numerous serious disciplinary infractions. Among other things, he broke a telephone in the visitation booth and then threatened the responding officer. After one altercation with a guard, it took 3 officers to subdue him. One officer's foot was fractured. In another incident, Nelson refused to return to his cell. 3 officers tried to escort him to his cell, but he stood in his cell door to prevent it shutting. When Officer Kent Williams reached in to slide the door shut, Nelson grabbed him, struck him in the face, pulled him into his cell, and threw him on the desk and into a wall. Nelson was also combative with other inmates and, on at least one occasion, was complicit in arranging for a bag, filled with feces and urine, to be placed in another inmate's cell. After he was assigned to a tank for problematic inmates, he broke the lights in his cell. On February 22, 2012, Nelson broke multiple fire sprinkler heads and flooded the day room. The jury saw photographs and video of this, including Nelson dancing in the water. 6 officers restrained him. Breaking the sprinkler heads triggered the fire alarm in the whole jail. On March 19, 2012, while Nelson was in the Tarrant County Jail awaiting trial in this case, he killed Jonathan Holden, a mentally challenged inmate, according to a fellow inmate who witnessed the incident. Holden had angered inmates when he mentioned the N-word under his voice. Nelson was in the day room of the holding area, and he talked Holden into faking a suicide attempt to cause Holden to be moved to a different part of the jail. Holden came to the cell bars, and Nelson looped a blanket around Holden's neck. Nelson then tightened the blanket by bracing his feet on the bars and pulling with both hands on the blanket. Holden's back was against the bars, and he was being pulled up almost off his feet. It took 4 minutes for Holden to die. Afterwards, Nelson did a celebration dance in the style of Chuck Berry, where he hops on one foot and plays the guitar. Nelson used a broomstick, which he had previously used to poke another mentally challenged inmate in the eye, as a guitar. On October 16, 2012, 25-year-old Stephen Lawayne Nelson was sentenced to death by Judge Mike Thomas, after all 12 jurors unanimously agreed to impose the death penalty. Reportedly, after his sentencing, Nelson flooded the courtroom with black fire-retardant liquid by breaking a fire sprinkler, in retaliation towards the judge and jury for sentencing him to death. Even after the end of his trial, Nelson continued to maintain his innocence in an interview with the Associated Press, and acknowledged he had anger problems, but denied he was a murderer. After spending close to 12 years on death row, Nelson received his death warrant and the execution order, which Judge Steven Jumes signed on June 10, 2024. The sentence is scheduled to be carried out on February 5, 2025. On November 15, 2024, a protest rally was held by a group of death penalty opponents to protest against Nelson's impending execution. As of December 2024, Nelson was one of the 4 condemned inmates from Texas to have their execution dates scheduled between February and April 2025. Judy Ann Elliott passed away September 9, 2024, and was last rest with her husband, John.